Hey there, welcome back. We are starting into complex trauma in adults. So, today we're going to look at understanding complex trauma in adults, and it's going to be like an overview of complex trauma, and we'll get more specific in this module as time goes on. So, in this video, you're going to learn how complex trauma is different from single incident trauma, layers of complex trauma, because there's many, and identifying emotional and psychological fragmentation. That fragmentation or dissociation is one of the more important parts of complex trauma because it's usually always in there in some way, shape, or form. And then we're going to look at the main indicators of complex trauma as well. Again, this is a quick overview of complex trauma, and we're going to dive deeper throughout this module. So let's get started. We are going to look at definitions from 3 experts in the field. Some of them really fit for single incident trauma, and some of them, one of them, of course, it's Janina Fisher, works very well for complex trauma because that's really where she has specialized and developed such wonderful resources for therapists. So, if we look at Bessel van der Kolk's definition of trauma, he says that trauma is specifically an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. So, that can be used for single incident trauma, which is a one-time event that happens, maybe like a car accident, a weather event, something that happens once and isn't repeated over a long period of time. Complex trauma is kind of woven into the person's life. It happens over a longer period of time, many incidents of trauma, and it's usually in the developmental years. So it's usually in younger children that they've experienced developmental trauma, and as an adult, it becomes complex trauma. Now, when working with intergenerational trauma, I like to make that distinction between developmental trauma as a child that shifts into complex trauma as an adult, because this is where we want to stick a wedge in this process so that the developmental trauma is less likely to develop into complex trauma. So for me, that distinction is very important when working with people and training therapists. So that was Bessel van der Kolk, an event that overwhelms the central nervous system, altering the way we process and recall memories. Daniel Siegel has a very simple explanation. He says it's an experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope. That could be either single incident or complex. Now, when we get to Janina Fisher, this is off her website, janinafisher.com/T-model. So she says that after a trauma, we're left with an inadequate record of what happened, no felt sense of its being over, and a little awareness of how we endured it. That's very important, that there's a felt sense that it may not be over and we really don't know what happened. So it's very diffuse, confusing, and overwhelming. Next part of her definition is if we had immediate support and safety afterward, we may be left shaken, but the events will feel behind us. So if we had parents or caregivers or people in our lives that came in, helped us stabilize, it would give us a sense that it's over. However, if the events were recurrent, or we were young and vulnerable, or don't have the adequate support, we can be left with a host of intense responses and symptoms that tell the story without words and without knowledge that we are remembering events and feelings from long ago. So there is not that distinction between current and past. It feels like it's happening in the here and now, and we may not have words for it. So that's hinting at implicit trauma, where we will have strong reactions, but we won't really understand why, because there won't be an obvious trigger that happened to cause that reactivity. She continues to say, worse yet, the survival response system may become chronically activated. So that's physiological arousal, autonomic arousal, and dysregulation, which results in long-term feelings of alarm and danger, tendencies to flee or fight under stress, debilitating feelings of vulnerability and exhaustion, or an inability to assert and protect ourselves. So that's the range from defensive response strategies, which are fight and flight, and kind of those submit and collapse strategies, that we just don't assert ourselves and we can't protect ourselves, which leaves the person at more risk for further trauma. To make that challenge even greater, therapy approaches that emphasize talking about events, so reviewing the event, rehashing it, talking about it in detail, result in more, not less, activation of trauma response and symptoms. So, this is the classic difficulty with complex trauma, that if you don't have a lot of training to know the difference between single incident and complex trauma, if you're having them tell the story and not doing that in a way that is less activating, it's going to re-traumatize the client to be delving into like the story or the talking about the event. So when we look at other fundamental differences, there is a difference in the duration and repeated nature. So single incident trauma, it's usually one trauma. They may have another trauma at a different time and a different type of trauma. So you could have a car accident and a weather-related event, or the traumatic loss of a family member. But they're not kind of bound in time traumatic events. So there's multiple traumatic events, and it's usually over a prolonged period of time. The next fundamental difference is the relationship dynamics. So complex trauma often involves some type of betrayal, abuse, or neglect by a caregiver or somebody close to the individual. While single incident trauma, it may not involve personal relationships like it would if it was traumatic grief or loss of a family member. It would if it was bullying. But in the context of complex trauma, really is a relational experience of trauma. So the abuse or betrayal within that relationship can be direct, it can be abusive, it can be things that are directly traumatic to the person, or it can be indirect. It can be things that we don't even notice that are missing, but we grow up with this sense of things just weren't okay. And that's more where you find the impacts of neglect. So what wasn't provided is what becomes traumatic. And this can be even more damaging because it really kind of creates a foundation of like not caring about the self, not having solid relationships, and not having what you needed to develop those secure attachments and skills and strategies for regulating the nervous system, all the developmental impacts. So those indirect, like that neglect, can be a really, really strong type of complex trauma. Complex trauma also impacts identity and personality. And you'll see this a lot. I just asked a question in my Facebook group about what kind of impacts do you see? And so far, there's a few responses, and they all mention personality. And that is because complex trauma becomes deeply integrated into the individual's identity and their worldview compared to more isolated effects of a single incident. So that's where you'll see huge impacts on who they think they are, who they believe themselves to be, how they understand themselves, and how their personality presents in the world and in relationship to others. These are the reasons that the unresolved complex trauma in a caregiver is one of the main transmitters of intergenerational trauma. It's because these impacts, how the duration of it, the impact, the changes in their identity and personality, all of those are the reason that that complex trauma in a adult, if it's unresolved, will create the developmental trauma for the child. This is where we need to break that up. So let's look at layers of complex trauma. Um, so with complex trauma, you usually have traumatic experiences that overlap or they reinforce each other and they compound the trauma. So you can have child abuse combined with ongoing domestic violence in adulthood, or you can have direct abuse of the child plus neglect, lack of food, economic insecurity, exposure to violence in the community. All of those overlap and they kind of collaborate and reinforce each other. So it reinforces the trauma related cognitions and self beliefs, those negative self beliefs. And again, between the ages of 5 to 7, we are in a state where our brains are kind of open and in more of a hypnotic state. We can't cognitively fact check. So, whatever gets laid down at that time, we're likely to really believe, even if it's not accurate. And those become those beliefs that are targeted in EMDR or cognitive behavior therapy of nobody loves me, I'm not a good person, I'm not safe. All those things that we look to target are typically developed at that time when we're much younger. So with the developmental trauma, that's why it's so important to assess that and get in there and learn what that person's beliefs are. Also, like the layers can be related to continued traumatic experiences in multiple life domains. So it can happen in the education system, can be hard to develop friends, or teachers may not understand or have compassion that there's neglect at home and they push and they try to help the student achieve, but it's just too much. They may have involvement in child welfare or child protective services, which can really be, that's hugely traumatic for a lot of families. In addition, the child's behavior that is normal and adaptive under the circumstances can unfortunately trigger the unresolved trauma in the parent and also creates another layer of trauma for the parent. So there can be this reciprocal process that the parent already has the complex trauma that's unresolved. The child experiences developmental trauma. That developmental trauma causes certain behaviors or interactions, difficulties that reinforce the parent's trauma and create another layer of trauma for the parent. So now we're going to look at social and cultural factors. And honestly, this can't be covered in one video. So this is a very surface overview of how these factors impact complex trauma. So, first of all, people who have grown up with complex trauma typically have a huge degree of hypervigilance, or if there's social and cultural factors, if you grow up in a situation where there's a lot of neglect or there's racial bias and racism, if there's like social difficulties, poverty, crime, those kinds of things, people grow up with very normal and natural hypervigilance and distrust of other people. So they may distrust people, schools, agencies, all of that. There's also mental and physical health impacts. So they are at higher risk of anxiety, depression, PTSD, cardiovascular events, hypertension, and it suppresses the immune system. There can also be a disconnection from heritage and culture, which typically provides a belonging and identity experience, which is really important for people because you can draw a lot of strength from that and a lot of resilience. So that's where racism can really impact the experience of complex trauma. Now we're going to look at poverty. So, excuse me. If there's exposure to food and housing insecurity, that's a whole nother level of trauma related that will reinforce and make the complex trauma much worse. When there is poverty, you usually see higher rates of neglect. There's less opportunity for education or employment, and there's excessive daily stress. So, poverty can be a huge contributor. And then we're going to look at community violence. So, this is exposure to trauma within the community. So, this will be arson, burning houses down, drive-by shootings, stabbings, all those kinds of things that are related to a lot of hypervigilance, vicarious trauma, and traumatic grief. Because they know people in the community, they may know several people who are killed or hurt because of the violence in the community. So now we're going to look at the generational impact and how it affects family dynamics and coping mechanisms. So trauma is transmitted across generations when that unresolved complex trauma in a caregiver impacts the attachment co-regulation and child development. So it impacts family dynamics and coping strategies because they may have very high reactivity or shutdown and collapse responses. They may go back and forth between the two. So this creates a lot of instability for the children in the family, and it really creates havoc in the family system itself. We also want to look at those negative beliefs and coping strategies that are passed down within families. So it may be beliefs like the world is a horrible place, you'll never be safe, no person is safe, people only hurt you. So they may grow up with those embedded beliefs in the family system. Or they may be exposed to very self-destructive coping strategies, substance abuse, relationships, gambling, those kinds of things that create more destruction within the person and in the family system. There may be cutoffs from previous generations, which means they don't have contact with, or they kind of are in opposition to previous generations or individuals in the family, which, if it's related to safety, cutoffs are most likely the best option. But if it's not, and we just have everybody has isolated this one person, that can end up coming back in the family system and kind of have the spontaneous emergence in a generation after that. Cutoffs also create split loyalties between family members. So that's where I can be in a relationship with one person, but because I'm in this relationship, I can't be in a relationship with this other person. And it creates a lot of stress and tension. Split loyalty is usually the underpinnings of a lot of personality difficulties and also self-harm and suicidal behavior. So we really need to look at those split loyalties in families. There can also be a loss or disconnection from family history, culture that they may have very significant anxiety related to their heritage, especially if there's some kind of cultural or racial trauma, because of bad things happen to this cultural group, that people will have a lot of anxiety around that. We're seeing now where that anxiety is kind of going down in the Indigenous community, and there's a lot of now pride in being Indigenous and heritage. So that's a good sign of healing. But we really want to be aware of that as well. Now we're going to look at emotional and psychological fragmentation. So basically, again, this is from Janina Fisher, where it basically has to do with memories, dissociation, and a fragmented sense of self. So that's like really compartmentalized pieces of the self. So Janina Fisher talks about pathogenic kernels of memory. So these are small pieces of trauma or trauma experience that become triggers, but they may not be obvious. So it may be like a gut feeling, or the feeling of in the pit of your stomach that causes a huge emotional reaction. It may be the absence of a caregiver at the time of trauma, maybe characteristics of a location like noise or different types of like temperature, those kinds of things. So, what will develop from that in these pathological kernels, you'll have either implicit memories or body memories. Implicit memories are below conscious awareness. So, they're basically unconscious. We don't remember them, but it's like the operating system in a computer. It drives your behavior, it drives how you see the world. So, it's really important to look for these pathogenic kernels because of those implicit memories. Body memories are typically sensations that are linked to previous trauma, but they don't have like an obvious connection. So it may be an overwhelming sense of dread or shame that comes totally out of the blue, but it's likely related when you have complex trauma. It's likely related to an experience in the past. So it might be crying in a crib and nobody comes and you're all alone. So that's a dread and shame that child experiences, but it doesn't record that that's what caused it. So then as an adult, when you experience that dread or shame, it seems like it comes out of the blue. And that's a body memory. Um, Emotional responses can be intense rage, deep shame. You can have regression or aggression. So, regression would be seeking proximity out of attachment needs that leads to clinging for survival. So, we will see this in relationships when a person is absolutely terrified that a relationship is going to end, and there's all kinds of pursuit. We see this in domestic violence and stalking. And that's that proximity seeking out of attachment needs that were not met or were frustrated earlier in life. We'll also see aggression. So there's just this fight response in current relationships due to previous disconnection or abuse in relationships. So that's like a high level pursuit. It can lead to both aggression and paranoia as well. So, looking at adaptive and maladaptive coping, um, what happens is we may have adaptive coping at the time of the trauma, which helps them survive. But in the long run, it becomes harmful because it's a survival response that's no longer useful or it creates other problems. So we'll see substance abuse, unhealthy relationships, self harm, suicide, really extreme anxiety, intense shame, caretaking of other people. So that's kind of your parentified children or people who learned that if they work really hard at kind of taming the lion, that they can be safe that way. So that'll show up in their adult relationships. And searching for somebody to rescue that leads to dependency in relationships. So those are some of the maladaptive coping that may have been adaptive at the time, but they're no longer adaptive now. One of these maladaptive coping responses is dissociation. It's very effective at the time of the incident, but it really interferes later on. So it's very protective and adaptive, but it's also extremely costly. So we're going to look at this more in the next part. So the main indicators of complex trauma, we have behavioral and psychological, and then physical and health. So behavioral indicators may be related to the avoidance of triggers, not wanting to be in certain areas, avoiding places, and it interferes with life experiences. So it starts to constrict the person's experiences and what they will do, the types of work they can get, the types of relationships they're in. Or there can be erratic reactions to stress. So the reaction may be extremely intense and it can be both shut down and defensive at the same time. So it's this conflicting pattern of get away from me or just not responding and not reacting to being very defensive. And there's also some self-harm that can occur in there as well. So, psychological indicators, there's a lot of them, are primarily flashbacks or body memories. So, that's reliving or re experiencing the event. These can be implicit or explicit. Implicit, it won't have any connection. There will be no awareness of why it's happening, but it's a very, very strong. Explicit, there will be some awareness of how something impacted the person and caused them to have this like flashback or body memory. There can be severe anxiety, a lot of distrust or paranoia, just not trusting people, not trusting systems, and having a lot of difficulty navigating the daily things in life. So now we're going to look more closely at dissociation under these psychological indicators. And I look at it, I do use Janina Fisher's approach with structural dissociation. And in that, she talks a lot about internal self alienation. So it's denial of internal parts that are typically related to trauma responses, but it's like, I didn't do it. It's not me. I don't know what happened. So there's like this self alienation where they're not connecting that these internal parts that are related to trauma responses are actually part of themselves. So they have this kind of fragmentation that happens. An increased dissociation leads to decreased integration. So their experiences, the parts, they become very walled off, or there's no memory across different states or parts. And when you get to there's primary, secondary, and tertiary dissociation. Tertiary is where those parts are walled off. That's the old diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder, where they fully embody a part and they may not have awareness of what has happened if they're not in that part. So they will have no memory of those parts and they're fully embodied. So usually you'll see going on with normal. This is the part of the personality that presents at work in social interactions with professionals. It's kind of, I've heard it also described as the person on the front porch and there's a house full of people. So this is what we see on the outside. That's going on with normal. That helps them compartmentalize and function, but it can cause a lot of difficulties as well. So the trauma-related parts of the personality are kind of the people inside the house, or the parts that are related to animal defenses. So that's structural dissociation is very neurobiological in nature, and it's really tied into those animal defenses of fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attach. So we know that fight, flight is running away, fighting off an attacker, or just freezing and not being able to being totally immobilized. Submit is kind of your caregiving, your just collapsing. And attach is that drive to be close to people. So this is where you can become people pleasing and that. So these are those parts that are related to those animal defenses. And that's how, in treating complex trauma from this perspective, you work with those parts and see how the cycle of how they impact each other and try to help those kind of come together and integrate, if the person is willing and if that's what you can get to. So now we're going to move into physical health indicators. So there are some huge somatic symptoms and health impacts of complex trauma. So you'll see a lot of chronic pain, a lot of fibromyalgia, a lot of kind of difficult, painful experiences that are kind of locked in the body, or the body becomes almost like frozen or hard. Those are highly linked to the chronic tension and stress of the dysregulated nervous system. So you can see a lot of gastrointestinal issues. So you'll see worsening colitis or irritable bowel syndrome. You'll see all those gastrointestinal issues, upset stomach, those kinds of things. You'll see sleep disturbances. So I see some kids that they don't sleep. They might sleep for 2 or 3 hours, then they're up in the middle of the night and they just never sleep, and that is from the degree of trauma that they've had. Can happen to adults as well. And we'll see also autoimmune disorders. So, a lot of difficulties where the immune system attacks itself. So, in conclusion, for this segment, we have defined the complex trauma versus individual trauma experiences or single incident traumas. We've looked at the layers of complex trauma, the emotional and psychological fragmentation, and main indicators of complex trauma. Again, this is just an introduction to this area. That we're laying the foundation to expand further in this module. So the main resources I would recommend is anything Janina Fisher has written or worked on. She has Healing the Fragmented Selves, which is about dissociation and complex trauma. She also has a workbook that is really, really helpful for clients in sessions. So those are really good resources. And like your greats like Bessel van der Kolk, Dan Siegel, they're all really good as well. So the next lesson, we are going to go deeper into recognizing complex trauma in adults and in the context of intergenerational trauma. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next lesson.